Hey there folks, Patrick here from Only Objects. We are a live dark synth pop quartet from Adelaide, South Australia, and we love electronic music. And more than that, you know, I love synthesizers, as you can probably see from this bank of glorious equipment just behind me here. Now, in the world of electronic music, there's a lot of gatekeeping when it comes to particularly synthesizers, what you should use, what you shouldn't use, what you have to own, why you can't make tracks with a Volca or a Behringer. And it's all garbage. You know, you can make great tracks with a cheap piece of gear. You can make rubbish tracks with an exceptionally expensive vintage piece of gear. It's about inspiration. It's about artistry. And that's what inspired me to do this new video series that I'm calling Synth Arc of Redemption, where I look at unloved, cheap and nasty, unknown synthesizers that I think are wonderful and you can have really great results with. I wanted to start today with this little beauty here, the Roland TB3. Look at it. It's so colorful. It's so bright. It's got so many lights. It's black and it's bright green, and it's a wonderful bassline synthesizer. Before we get to talking about that, I need to give you guys a little quick history lesson about the Roland TB303, the synthesizer that essentially invented acid house music. So here we go. Cast your mind back to 1982, and Roland, in their wisdom, release a very strange little synthesizer called the TB303. It was claimed that it was supposed to emulate a bass guitar, and it basically never did what it said on the tin. Very, very simple little synth, one oscillator, analog subtractive synthesis, and it could do a sawtooth or a square wave. Now, Roland marketed it as an accompaniment for, say, guitarists who don't have access to a bass player to fill in gaps in bands, so on and so forth, and it essentially utterly fails because it sounded nothing like a bass guitar. It had this weird sort of squelchy, strange noise that people tended to find unappealing. So it was discontinued by 1984, and Roland sold the remaining units off pretty damn cheap. And sort of the starting point of where it entered the public consciousness was in Detroit. The band Future bought one of these things for next to nothing and used them on a track called Acid Tracks. And they discovered something very, very important, which is, and I'm using the TB3 for comparison here. If you tweak the cutoff and resonance knobs, you get this sort of squelchy, interesting, unusual sound that's deeply, deeply fascinating. I'm going to give you guys a little example on here. Then you start tweaking. And pretty soon you're getting this high resonance. And when you swoop back down, and that's an approximation of the one of the waves. If we go to the other one, so anyway, it's this great tone and basically invents acid house music. And this kickstarted the second summer of love, the rave movement. All of it leads back to this one tiny little synthesizer that Roland, in all of their infinite wisdom, have never really reissued properly despite people asking for it. So flash forward into the 2000s and the original 303 is going for silly, silly money. And I'm not even kidding here. A couple of years ago, I was watching a big online auction of electronic music equipment, and I watched a couple of 303s go for about $3,500 Australian dollars. $3,500! And like, it's a great little synthesizer. It's an important piece of dance music history, but it is not worth $3,500. And if you bought one, I'm sorry, you were very, very silly for that price. And that's where this guy comes in. So let's talk about this properly. TB303, it costs literally a tenth of that. I bought this for about $370 maybe 6 or 7 years ago. They came out around 2013, 2014. Obviously, it's not an exact copy of the 303. It doesn't look like it, doesn't have the style. Instead, it's got this kind of funky, space age, black and fluorescent green thing. And it's part of Roland's Era series that they also release along with an 808 clone and a few other bits and pieces as well. But the 808 and the 303 were the ones that people were excited about. The TB3 is wacky, which is great because the 303 itself was wacky, was always a strange bit of kit. So let me give you guys a little bit of a rundown on some of the features. As I told you guys before, we've got the two basic waves. So if you want the classic 303 sound, we're all over it. And the thing worth noting is if you had an original 303, that's all that did. A lot of the classic sounds that people got during the acid house movement came from running stuff through guitar pedals, getting distortions, and just generally playing around with the unit. This guy has got all that in here. So if we want to go something a little bit more distorted for something like this guy. As well as that, we've got a bunch of dedicated bass sounds that sound nothing like the 303. I'm just picking one at random here. And we've also got a dedicated effects control here, which, look, in some instances does do useless stuff like giving you a bunch of delay and reverb on sub bass. That's a whole nother conversation. But nonetheless, you can get some really unusual sounding stuff. Now this sounds nothing like a 303 at this point, but it kind of doesn't sound like anything else either. It's just a really unusual sounding synthesizer. It's big, it's crunchy, it's quite analog sounding for a digital synth as well. But what else can it do? Obviously, it's replaced the buttons with a touchpad, which isn't super helpful, but it looks cool. You can play it with the XY axis as well. It's got step record, it's got real-time record. I'd recommend the step record over the real-time record. You can also just use the keyboard to interrupt the sequence as well. So if we're easily transpose stuff as well with a little bit of fiddling around. It's got your sequencer in here, so it's pretty all-purpose. We've also got an entire another bank of just synth noises as well. There, some of the reverbs are kind of helpful. And the one I really like as well is the scatter control, which gives you a bunch of ways to modulate the sound, essentially. I particularly like this one, which just gives you a little bit of movement, so you're playing along and we get this. Generally, the synth is great at sounding kind of weird and destroyed and a little bit unusual, which is what I like out of my synthesizers. You can also just nicely pair it up with a good drum machine. I've got the Arturia Drum Brute Impact. Got the analog kick. Pair it together with this guy. MIDI syncs beautifully, super straightforward. And, you know, we can go back and start getting something like this. Get a bit of that scatter going. Combine it with the drum machine rolls. So in short, they play really nicely together. And then once we go back to our more traditional kind of sounds, then we've got some really good business that we're playing with here. And that's it, the Roland TB3. It's a fantastic alternative to the actual 303. It won't cost you $3,500. It's got a few weird things as well. It does audio interface on the USB out that I've had limited success with. Difficult to program the slides via MIDI is my understanding. But in terms of a fantastic performance synth that you can just plug in and do something fun with, you can't beat this guy. It's fantastic. So that's it, the Roland TB3. It's a fantastic little synth. Don't believe the bad hype. It's a wonderful box of weird electronics that makes great squelchy noises, does great acid house, but also does all these other synthesizer sounds as well in so many banks. If you don't believe me on how great this is, you can actually go and check out the very first single we ever released as a band called Dress for the End. And the synth was featured prominently on there. It drives the entire song. And you know what? It sounds great. So go check it out. onlyobjects.bandcamp.com or anywhere else that you guys get your music from. If you've enjoyed this content, please do comment below, like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. If you're on Facebook, do whatever it is that you do on Facebook. Keep checking in here because I'm going to be back real soon with episode 2 of Synth Arc of Redemption, where we're going to be talking about more great weird synthesizers. In the meantime, peace and electronic music. Patrick out.